hold on to that passage if you can, because I will be referring to it again shortly. Thank you for your prayers and phone messages and so forth over the last couple of weeks in regard to surgery and whatever sort of bug I had. Still have a bit of. Think back to the book of Acts. At some point in time, possibly up to 10 years after the church had its beginning, Saul of Tarsus was en route to the city of Damascus, about 213 kilometers northeast of the city of Jerusalem. And he was there in his self-appointed task, if you like, of trying to wipe out the church. And as he came near to Damascus, a bright light shone around him and a voice questioned him. And Saul asked, "Who are you, Lord?" Now, Saul at that moment did not know who was speaking, had no idea. He certainly didn't believe at that point it to be Jesus. He didn't believe that Jesus was the Son of God, the crucified and risen one. When Saul asked, "Who are you, Lord?" what did he mean by the word Lord? Well, there's several ways in which the word Lord can be used, and Vine says one of its meanings is a title of courtesy addressed to a stranger. A bit like you see police, when they pull you over, will politely say, you know, "How are you going, sir?" I'm not sure what they say to women. I haven't been in a car when Lavinia's been stopped. But they'll say politely, "How are you, sir? Can I see your license, please, sir?" Things like that. And so it's thought that that's the way Saul was speaking. "Who are you, Lord? Who are you, sir?" Well, that question has continued down through the ages, and it comes right down to modern times. There are some who believe that Jesus is nothing more than a myth, never existed. There are some who say, well, he was a religious teacher, but that's all he was. He wasn't divine. He was just a human being. There are others who see him as some sort of social activist. Some of you will remember the song, indeed the musical, Jesus Christ Superstar. And that song questions the identity of Jesus. Jesus Christ, who are you? What have you sacrificed? Jesus Christ, superstar, do you think you're who they say you are? Well, I want to look today at things that are said about Jesus in Hebrews chapter 1, and particularly here, verses 5 and 6. For to which of the angels did God ever say, "You are my son, today I have begotten you"? Or again, "I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son"? And again, when he brings the firstborn into the world, he says, "Let all God's angels worship him." And those are all references to Jesus. So you'll notice you've got three descriptions there: that he is God's son, that he is the one begotten by God, that he is the firstborn. And so I want to look at those three, although in a slightly different order. I'll start with the word begotten, and then firstborn, and then come to the idea of Jesus being the Son of God. So first of all, we take the word begotten from verse 5. "You are my son, today I have begotten you." According to Wigram's lexicon, the Greek word translated begotten can mean to come into existence, to be created, to exist by creation, to be born, to be produced, to grow. And the word is indeed used as translated as born in such passages as Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 and 4 there. Thank you. So because there's this idea of birth, then there are some, and particularly the Jehovah's Witnesses, who have concluded that Jesus Christ is a being created by God, and because he's created by God, then he cannot be the same as God. But there's a fundamental mistake, error, with such reasoning, and that is the idea that a word has just one meaning and that meaning applies in all cases. Now that's not true. It's not true in English, it's not true in other languages, it's certainly not true in the case of Greek, and Greek was the language in which the New Testament was originally written. Indeed, I was going through the dictionary during this past week, looking at musical meanings of the word round, R-O-U-N-D. And I was really surprised to find that in the Macquarie dictionary, there were 90 definitions of the word round. 90 definitions. Shows you just how words can have a diversity of meanings. And so it is in regard to the word that is translated begotten. In the Greek, this word actually has several meanings. I've already read some that are given by Wigram in his lexicon, but some other meanings that are given by Wigram are to be appointed, to come into a particular state or condition. So that word appointed is a key one in this context. Because if we insist that the word begotten means that Jesus was born in the sense of being created, then we run into a problem. Because there's a clash in the New Testament regarding when he was supposedly created. For instance, we have here in verse 5, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." When was he begotten, if you take it as meaning created? Well, in verse 6, we've got the word firstborn, and firstborn, like the word begotten, can have the idea of birth. Verse 6 says, "And when he brings the firstborn into the world." So Jesus, according to verse 6, was born or created either already before he came into the world or at the time that he came into the world. But on the other hand, you go back to Acts chapter 13 and there have a look at verses 32 and 33. This is where Paul is preaching, and it says there in verse 32 of Acts 13, "And we bring you the good news that what God promised to the fathers, this he has fulfilled to us their children, by raising Jesus, just as also it is written in the second Psalm, 'You are my son, today I have begotten you.'" When is it applied there? It's applied in the context to Jesus being raised up, it says in the early part of verse 33. So according to Hebrews chapter 1, he was born when he came to earth, created perhaps even before he came to earth. Here it says that he was begotten or born with the crucifixion and resurrection. So it's difficult to say that the word begotten means born, because it creates a sort of contradiction here. We know that Jesus existed before his resurrection, because back in Matthew chapter 3 and verse 17, at the time of Jesus' baptism, God the Father said, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am pleased," or well pleased. Then Matthew chapter 17 and verse 5, at the time of Jesus' transfiguration, God the Father said, "This is my beloved Son with whom I am well pleased." So he existed before his resurrection. So how do we take this word begotten? We come back to one of the definitions that we got from Wigram in his lexicon of Greek words, the idea of appointment. Jesus was appointed as Lord, as Saviour, as High Priest. It's not talking about him being created. It's not talking about him being brought into existence. But rather, if you look at this idea of today I have begotten you, you'll see it's used in reference to Jesus being raised up to be at God's right hand. For instance, if you're still there in Acts chapter 13, I'll start in verse 29. Paul here is referring to the fact that Jesus was crucified. And then verse 29, and when they had carried out all that was written of him, written of Jesus, they took him down from the tree and laid him in the tomb. Now, you say, why tree there? Well, that's linked in with Old Testament language, so it's using the word tree there sort of as an illustration or symbolically. Verse 30, but God raised him from the dead, and for many days he appeared to those who had come up with him from Galilee to Jerusalem, who are now his witnesses to the people. And we bring you the good news that what God promised to the fathers, this he has fulfilled to us, their children, by raising Jesus, as also it is written in the second Psalm, you are my son, today I have begotten you. So there, quite plainly, the idea of begotten is used in the context of Jesus' resurrection. Then we go back to Hebrews 1, where I started off. In Hebrews 1, I'll begin reading from verse 3. And again, this is speaking of Jesus. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purification for sins, and that was at his crucifixion, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much superior to angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. For to which of the angels did God ever say, you are my son, today I have begotten you? But there, that idea of Jesus being begotten is used in the context of his resurrection and his ascension to God's right hand. And then we go over a bit further to Hebrews chapter 4, verses 14 through 16, talks about Jesus being our sympathetic high priest. What does a high priest do? Well, we're given an explanation from the Old Testament high priests in chapter 5 and verse 1. For every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. So that's what Jesus Christ would have been doing and is doing. He acts on our behalf. He is offered a sacrifice. Now notice verse 4, and no one takes this honour for himself, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was. So Jesus cannot be a high priest unless he was called by God. Verse 5, so also Christ did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, but was appointed by him who said to him, you are my son, today I have begotten you. As he says in another place, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek, and you can keep on reading there. So what do we see? This idea of God having begotten Jesus Christ is not talking in the context of creating Jesus, but rather talking in the context of him being raised up from the dead, of being raised up to the right hand of God, of being raised up to be our high priest. So it's the idea of appointment. It's the idea of Christ being glorified, of being raised up to a position above all of us. It's the exaltation of Jesus, if you want to put it that way. So that's the first idea back in Hebrews chapter 1, that he is the one begotten by God. He is the one placed in an exalted position. It's not talking about him being born in the sense of being created. That's one word. Another word is down in Hebrews 1 and verse 6. Again, when he brings the firstborn into the world. So what is this word firstborn? And some will say, well, it means first to be born. Again, we've got to consider that words have various meanings. There's a key use of the word firstborn over in Colossians chapter 1 and verse 15, which I want us to notice. Colossians 1 and verse 15. He, talking of Jesus Christ, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. Again, the Jehovah's Witnesses seize upon that word firstborn, and they say it means first to be born. Here you'll notice it says the firstborn of all creation. So people like the Jehovah's Witnesses who take that view say that what it means is Jesus is a created being, the difference being that he was the first to be created, based upon interpreting the word firstborn as first to be born. But it's again the same mistake of saying that a word only has one meaning in all cases. That is not the case with the word, the Greek word that is translated firstborn. And indeed, even here in Colossians 1:15 and 16, you can see that there's a problem if you say it means first to be born, first to be created. Again, verse 15, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, for by him all things were created in heaven and earth. And so you can go on. So the view of the Jehovah's Witnesses is that he was the first to be created. And he created all things. But there's a difficulty there. According to them, this is saying he's created. And it's saying he created all things. Well, if he's created and he created all things, then he must have created himself. And that's not logical. The Jehovah's Witnesses recognize that. So if you go to their Bible, the New World Translation, you'll find that verse 16 reads this way, for by him all other things were created. And so they've added the word other there in the New World Translation. There's a problem with that. In my two Greek New Testaments, the word other doesn't appear. And I've got the New World Translation. I've got 16 other English versions of the Bible at home. Not one of those 16 versions uses the word other. It's not there. It says Jesus is the firstborn of all creation, for by him all things were created. We don't have to play around with it. Well, what does the word firstborn mean? The Greek word that's translated firstborn. Well, Thayer says that it can have the meaning of supreme rank. Vine, in his Dictionary of New Testament Words, says that the Greek word is expressing his priority to, Jesus' priority to, and preeminence over creation, not in the sense of being first to be born. In other words, Vine is saying it has, again, the idea of supreme rank. Bauer, in his lexicon, says this, that the Greek word is also used in some instances where it is uncertain whether the force of the element tokos is still felt at all. Let me explain that. The Greek word translated firstborn is prototokos. pro meaning first, tokos coming from the word to beget, to be born. So if taken literally, yes, the word means first to be born. But Bauer makes the point, as do others, that the point was reached where the word lost that meaning, and it just came to have the idea of rank. And that's quite logical, because for a long time in history, the firstborn was the one who had the privileges, the one who got the greatest share of the inheritance. And so the word came to convey that idea, the one of leading position, and lost the idea of meaning first to be born. And that happens with a lot of English words. Get out the Oxford English Dictionary, all umpteen volumes of it, and look at some of the words. Some of the words we use today are used differently to the way they were used 100 years ago. So with this word prototokos, which is translated first to be born, firstborn. Cattell says the word also means first in rank, superior rank. The International Standard Bible Encyclopedia regarding Jesus Christ says that the word denotes his status and character and not his origin. So over and over again, the scholars who understand the language say, look, you can't just assume that that word means that he was the first to be born in the sense of first to be created. The word has other meanings. And the meaning that is consistent with that verse and with other passages is that he is the one of first rank. Why? Because by him all things were created. That's the point that he's making. His high standing. And people say, well, yeah, but I have difficulty with that. I can't really believe that Jesus Christ is the same as God. After all, when he was on earth, he prayed to the Father. He called God Father. He put himself in a subservient position to the Father. So that indicates he's not the same as God. When you argue that way, you're overlooking something about what happened to Jesus in coming to earth. We go back to John chapter 1, verse 1. John 1 and verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So in the beginning, there was something called the Word, who was God. Who is this Word? John chapter 1 and verse 14. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glorious of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Who is the Word? He is the Son. And if you read on from verse 14, it's Jesus Christ. So before he came to earth, he was referred to as the Word, who was with God and was God. But in coming to earth, he took a step down. You go over to Philippians chapter 2, beginning in verse 5. Here, where Paul is talking about the idea of humility. Philippians chapter 2 and verse 5. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. And people seize on that. And they say, look, he didn't grasp equality with God, so therefore he didn't have it. Again, the word has several meanings. The Greek word translated grasp can either mean reach out to grab something you haven't yet got, or it can mean to hold on to something you have got. Now, what did we read about the pre-existent Christ in John chapter 1 and verse 1? In the beginning was the Word, he was with God, and he was God. He had equality with God. So here in Philippians 2 and verse 8, it is not saying that Jesus didn't reach out to grab equality. It's saying Jesus didn't hang on to that equality which he already had, but rather where was I? verse 7, Philippians 2, but made himself nothing, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. My point is that Jesus had equality with God before he came to earth. He didn't hang on to it, but rather he emptied himself, he lowered himself, he put himself in a position of subservience to God the Father in order to carry out God's will. And that's why up here on earth he prayed to God as the Father, because he had put himself in subjection to the Father. But people will still say, I just can't accept that Jesus Christ is one with God. Well, Colossians chapter 1 and verse 15, which we've already read. He is the image of the invisible God. He is the invisible God made visible. Colossians chapter 1 and verse 19. For in him, Jesus Christ, all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. Or Colossians 2 and verse 9. For in him the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily. We can go back to the Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 3, which I read a while ago. Again, is talking about Christ. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power, and so on. It's all saying he is God. And then there are those who say, yes, but Jesus never called himself God. Well, I preached on that some years ago. Let's go back to just one reference. John chapter 8 and verse 58, where Jesus here is speaking to the people around him. John 8 and verse 58. Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. Now, Abraham, his birth dates back to about 2100 BC. Jesus says, before he was, I am. Well, that's a strange way to say it, I am. Well, that has significance. If you come back to Exodus chapter 3, where God is speaking to Moses from the bush, the burning bush, Exodus chapter 3 and verse 13. Remember, God is telling Moses to go back to Egypt and to ask Pharaoh to let the Israelites go free. Exodus 3 verse 13, when Moses said to God, then Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. That comes from the Hebrew word Yahweh, which I talked about some time back. So when Jesus said before Abraham was, I am, he was using the name of God. And you say, oh, that's just a coincidence. Well, if you read John 8 and verse 59, that's not the way his listeners heard it. They took up stones to stone him. Why? Because in their mind, Jesus was blaspheming. And people say, oh yeah, well, that was just a mistaken understanding. Well, if it was just a mistake, why didn't Jesus say so? He could have solved all the problems there and then and said, no, that's not what I mean by using the word I am. But Jesus didn't say, no, you've got it all wrong. Jesus himself said, before Abraham was, 2,000 years ago, I am. Before Abraham was, I'm Yahweh. So you've got a whole string of passages, and there's more that we could look at, all pointing to the fact that Jesus is indeed God, the invisible God made visible, God come to earth. So that's the words firstborn and the word begotten. It's talking about Jesus' rank. So that brings us in Hebrews chapter 1 to the fact that Jesus is also called the Son of God, and that in many people's minds is understood in the sense of, well, a son is one who is born, and comes into being, and so forth. Well, we've already seen briefly that various Bible passages describe Jesus Christ as God. So what does it mean when it says that Jesus Christ is God's Son? What's the Bible doing? The Bible is conveying eternal, heavenly, spiritual truths to we who are earthly, who are physical, who are mortal in the sense that we die. How do you communicate that? Just signal. Is there anybody here who has never experienced snow? You've never been in snow, you've never touched snow, you've never walked through it. Okay, there's a few of you. I grew up in snow. I lived through the winter of 62, 63 in England, which was one of the worst winters on record. So I know something about snow. How do I communicate that to you who have not been in snow? And let's assume for a moment we haven't seen movies and TV and all those sorts of things. How do I communicate it? I've got to use ideas that are familiar to you. So I might say, you know, if you've grown up in Australia and travelled, I might say, well, have you seen the salt lakes in places like Western Victoria and South Australia and Western Australia? Great expanses where there's no water in these lakes. It's just a crust of salt. Have you seen that? Well, that's something like snow, except snow is a whole lot colder. You say, well, I haven't seen a salt lake. Okay. Have you seen table salt? Most of us would say yes. Okay. Imagine a situation where everything, the buildings, the trees, the ground, everything was covered in a thick layer of salt, except much colder. Well, that's something like snow. Well, I've never seen snow. I've never seen salt. How about sugar? Have you seen sugar? Okay, imagine everything covered with, sooner or later we get some sort of comparison to give you an idea. And so the Bible uses the word son. As we've seen, it doesn't mean that Jesus was literally born in the sense of being created. But the word son illustrates certain things about Jesus that we can grasp. For instance, going back to John chapter 1 and verse 1, the word son conveys the idea of the closeness of relationship. If you are somebody's son, there is a close relationship between you and your parent. So it is with Jesus Christ. John chapter 1 and verse 1, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. Who is the Word? John chapter 1 and verse 14, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us as the only Son from the Father. So Son is conveying closeness of relationship. It also indicates likeness. A son is like the parent in that they have the same nature. In the case of human beings, the son is human with all the characteristics that his father has as a human being. And so Colossians chapter 1 and verse 9 was saying that Jesus is of the same nature as the Father. Colossians 1 verse 19, for in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. Chapter 2 verse 9, for in him the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily. So the same nature. And then the word son also indicates the idea of submission. The son obeys the parent, and Jesus Christ subjected himself to God the Father. And there's a whole heap of verses that we could read. I'll just read one of them from John chapter 6 and verse 38 here. This is Jesus speaking, John chapter 6 and verse 38. For I have come down from heaven not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. In that way, he was a son to the Father. So he is a son in the sense of closeness of relationship with God. He is a son in the sense of having the same nature as God. He is a son in the sense that he has placed himself in obedience to the Father. So Jesus Christ is the Son in the sense of the relationship with the Father and his nature, having the same nature. And that is unique. Nothing in creation holds that relationship. Jesus is God's only Son, John 3:16. Or to use the language of the King James Version, he is the only begotten. So in Hebrews chapter 1, verses 5 and 6, as well as in other parts of the Bible, Jesus Christ is described as the one begotten by God, the firstborn of God, the Son of God. And none of those are saying that he is a created being who is therefore less than God. Because various Bible passages, a range of Bible passages, describe him as being God. God come to earth, God in the flesh, the invisible God made visible. Nothing in creation can make that claim. As a sort of condensation of the book of Hebrews, it is pointing to the superiority of Jesus Christ. He is greater than angels. He is greater than Moses. He is greater than the Levitical priesthood. He is greater than the Old Testament animal sacrifices. He is greater because of his unique relationship with God the Father. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That is why we need to respect him. And we need to honour him. And we need to dedicate ourselves to him. And we need to obey him. And we need to walk with him for the rest of our lives. Following Jesus should not be just a maybe, when I'm comfortable, when it's convenient. We're talking about somebody who was God in the flesh, who went back to be with God and is there now. And he deserves, he wants utmost commitment to him. He needs to be a priority in our lives. Let's stand.